Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Viewers, Adab. We are back again with our Mukalma series at Auliya Council of North America from New York. We again have the pleasure and honor of having Dr. Umashankar back. As you know, she's professor of Islam at Iona College in New York, and today we are going to discuss the central idea of God or godliness that is the I would call it the driving force of Sufism. There are many terms that come to surface with this idea. One being wujud, or the presence of God, wahdatul wujud. There is this idea of God being haq. So I'd like Rachana to go through these. If you can elaborate on these and walk us through how this central idea of God is structured and looked upon by Sufis.
Thank you again for having me. It's always a pleasure to have these conversations with you. So you mentioned the concept of wahdatul wujud. So we can definitely dive in right away with that. Before I can explain the idea of wahdatul wujud, I should probably introduce the audience to two other concepts, two concepts in English, which I think once we get a grasp of those, then it will become easier to move to explaining the idea of wahdatul wujud. And the two words are transcendence and immanence. Right? So transcendence, that word means something that is beyond or above, right? Removed from, and the word immanence, which is spelled IMMANENCE, right? Immanence means something that is within, something that is inherent to, right? Something that is a part of, internally a part of something. So in general, theologically speaking, if we look at different religious traditions around the world, the idea of God, the idea of divinity, however it may be identified, right? The idea of in a very broad sense, the idea of a great power in the universe, right? Being called by whatever name, depending on the religious tradition. In many religious traditions, there is often the notion of God or this power being transcendent, being immanent, where the idea of this power being separate from creation is known as transcendence, so God as transcendent, or the idea of this power being inherently, inseparably a part of creation. That is the idea of immanence. So the idea of God is immanent. Okay? So these various notions of understanding this power in the universe, understanding divinity, understanding God, have been categorized into these two words. When we think about, in theological terms, we can think of this is a transcendent idea of God. This is an immanent idea of God. And since we're talking about Islam, from this point onwards, I will just refer to this power as God, just to keep it simple. So, in many monotheistic, traditions within Christianity, within Judaism, within Islam, there is often a tussle between these two understandings of God, right? So the big theological question is, is God transcendent or is God immanent, right? So again, let me try and break down those ideas a little further.
Please.
So when we ask, is God transcendent, right? What is being asked there? We're asking if God as the creator is separate from creation, right? That is, if you visualize a creator who creates, then there is the creator and the created are not the same. There is a separation, a gap between the creator and what the creator has created, right? And in that sense, this is the idea of God as transcendent, God as removed from creation, God as beyond creation in some way. Right? The other notion of God is immanent, identifies the creator and the created as being not separate, right? That yes, the creator has created everything, but the process of creation is not a process of separation. That in the process of creation, the divine is present within, that is, the divine is immanent in creation. Right? So these are theologically two ways of thinking about the divine. Right? And philosophers, theologians throughout history have argued deeply, especially in the three monotheistic traditions, right? Especially in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the Abrahamic religions. Scholars have in perpetuity argued about the nature of God, and especially in terms of, is God transcendent, is God immanent? And of course, people on either side of that divide accuse people on the other side of the divide of all kinds of heresies. Right? So this is a continuing, in many ways, a debate that has not fully been resolved. And
I don't think it will be. That's my opinion, and I think it's good to hold two ideas at the same time. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yes, and the idea
or more competing ideas.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, as I mentioned with the discussion of Ishq in the last video, at some level, when you start thinking about the metaphysics of Sufism, it becomes impossible to resolve some of these ideas. The solution is paradoxical, right? That there is no non-paradoxical solution to some of these problems. And yes, you're absolutely right. So holding both of these ideas together. And that very, very nicely brings me to the concept of wahdatul wujud. So let's just sort of keep in mind these two concepts of God is transcendent and God is immanent. Okay, bookmark those ideas. Now let's unpack the phrase wahdatul wujud itself, right? So wahdatul wujud, wahdat being oneness, unity, and wujud can be translated as being or existence. Personally, I prefer existence to being, but that's my own personal preference. So moving forward, I will refer to it as unity of existence or oneness of existence. So this phrase wahdatul wujud, usually attributed to Ibn Arabi, but he doesn't ever use this term. But his ideas tend towards wahdatul wujud. So what is wahdatul wujud? The idea in wahdatul wujud is that if God is understood as an all-powerful entity, right? As the I think, is it Surah 113 or 112 perhaps? Al-Ikhlas, I forget the number. In Surah Al-Ikhlas, God is referred to as a samad, right? Eternal. So, which is the implication of that is God as neither having a beginning nor an end. Or another way to understand it is infinite, right? Neither beginning nor end. And so if we're thinking about an all-powerful God, if we're thinking about a God who is eternal, without beginning, without end, then logically, the wahdatul wujudis will argue, logically, God as a category that encompasses everything has to encompass, divinity has to encompass itself, right? That is, if you say that God is something but is not something, then that somehow negates the notion of the infinity of the divine, right? That God has to encompass contradictions, right? That God has to be this and that and nothing, right? For God um, for God to be all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful, the all in that, right? The unity in that, the oneness of it, must encompass not just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to n, but it must encompass 0 and -1, -2, -3, -4. Right? If we speak about infinity in mathematical terms, right, it has to be positive, negative, nothing, all. So, from that perspective, if we think about the divine as one, if we think of divine as fully one, then God, in a sense, has to be both transcendent and immanent. That the choice is a false choice. That God must at once, right? The infinite power of God must allow God, or must imply that God is both transcendent and immanent, right? That God is both in some ways beyond creation, but also in some ways completely intertwined in creation. There are many ways in which this is understood. So there's not just one interpretation of this. There are many ways in which this idea can be interpreted. But I can offer some couple at least of interpretations of this. One interpretation of this, one way to understand this, is to think about the immanence of God as the athair, the traces of the divine in creation, right? And you can, again, I love using metaphors and analogies because they help you grapple with these big ideas. If you think about the process of creation like a potter shaping a pot, right, on a potter's wheel, it would be as if the potter creates the pot, but the traces of the divine on creation are like the fingerprints of that the potter leaves behind. Right? And the fingerprints are not the potter, but they are not the potter either. Right? They are very much an imprint of the potter on what he or she has made. Similarly, right, that the imprint of the divine, the essence of the divine, which we can call athair or ayats, the signs or the traces of God, are similarly left on creation. So in that sense, creation, the process of creation cannot be fully understood as a separation. That there is both immanence and transcendence. Right? So that's one way to think about it, one interpretation of it. Another interpretation of it is that the idea of how to explain this, that God can be both transcendent and immanent, is the idea of, you mentioned haqq, right? The idea of truth, and of course, another word that comes out of haqq is haqiqa, reality, right? So haqq and haqiqa, truth and reality, and haqq, as I mentioned in the previous video, can mean both truth and God, right? It's the word can apply to both truth and God, and the idea there being that God is the ultimate truth, and therefore, in a way, that the only true reality that is possible is the divine. And so, if we see God as a haqq, if we see God as the ultimate truth, then there can be nothing beyond that, right? So in that sense, God cannot be only transcendent, because everything that God has created exists within that truth, right? Within the truth of God. And so God must be immanent to creation as well. So those are a couple of ways in which this paradox, right, this balance between transcendence and immanence, is maintained within certain Sufi traditions. Right? So I think that's a good, as brief as I possibly can be, explanation
very well
of
said.
wahdatul wujud.
Very well said. But then there are other streams of thought that oppose this, or I would say not oppose, but were contrary to this idea, like wahdatul shuhud. So could you elaborate on those two?
Yeah. Okay. So I don't necessarily think that wahdatul wujud and wahdatul shuhud are contrary to each other, and I will get to why I don't think so. But to explain wahdatul shuhud, so wahdatul shuhud, the phrase means unity or oneness of witness. So shuhud being witness, or perhaps even loosely can be translated as perception. When you witness something, you're perceiving it in that context, right? So unity of witness is usually how it is translated. Okay, so wahdatul shuhud emerges as a sort of critique, again, not necessarily in opposition to wahdatul wujud, but as an attempt at a correction or an attempt at a reorientation of wahdatul wujud. And again,
I read that this is mostly from the subcontinent. Is that correct?
wahdatul shuhud.
Correct.
You see it in Sir Hindi's discussion of wahdatul wujud, in wahdatul wujud and wahdatul shuhud. Sir Hindi discusses that, but I'm not entirely sure enough to say, oh, this is primarily a subcontinental thing. There may be other forms of Islam in South Asia is my area of expertise, but I'm sure scholars of Islam in the Turkish tradition or the West African tradition or the Gulf tradition might have other sort of insights on this, but you've reached the limit of my knowledge there, so I'm not sure. But I do know that it was definitely a preoccupation of many South Asian scholars of Islam, and especially Sufism. So why the correction? Why the critique? Right? Why this attempt to reorient wahdatul wujud? The reason being that there was a strain of opposition to wahdatul wujud from scholars and theologians who considered the dance that wahdatul wujudis were engaged in with the idea of immanence, right? They found that to be uncomfortable, to say the least, right? That is, the accusations at the most extreme, the accusation leveled against Wahdatul Wujudis was that it was pantheism. Right? Now, what is pantheism? Pantheism is the idea that God is everything. Right? So the notion there is, if you think of God as fully immanent, then and the idea that God is in everything, or God is everything, right? That is, God is creation. Then what stops you from worshipping a tree? What stops you from worshipping a mountain? What stops you from worshipping a frog, right? Or a human being, right? What would prevent you from doing that? Logically, you could say, oh, God is in everything. I worship you. You are God, right? And that the idea of pantheism then is almost is quite can be contrary, again, depending on how you're thinking about it. A lot of these are perspectival issues. But the idea of pantheism can be seen as directly contradictory to the idea of monotheism, right? And Tawheed, the oneness of God, is a core principle of Islam. Like if one had to identify one principle of Islam as paramount, it would be Tawheed. It would be the oneness of God. And so that these opposing scholars identified was that, oh, if you start saying that God is immanent, then that means God is no longer one, God is fragmentary. And God then becomes multiple. Okay? And that kind of pantheism is seen as sacrilegious, right? Heretical. So that was the true opposing viewpoint to Wahdatul Wujud. And Wahdatul Shuhud emerged as a way to kind of nudge Wahdatul Wujud away from so much dalliance with the immanence part of it, if you will, right? So the Wahdatul Shuhud criticism or Wahdatul Wujud idea, and not Wujud, Wahdatul Shuhud idea is that any conception of the nature of reality is necessarily limited by the limited perspective of the human being. Right? That is that what we witness is what we witness, right? And so there is only one. We are limited to the one perspective, right? The Wahdatul Shuhud, the oneness of witness. And so from our vantage point, right, we may perceive God as whatever, right? We may perceive God in a certain way, but that cannot be identified as Haqq, but rather our witnessing of Haqq. And these are not the same thing. Right? And again, there are multiple interpretations of this. I'm offering us a very kind of simple, basic, explanation of this, without going into a whole lot of weeds. So really, the relationship between Wahdatul Wujud and Wahdatul Shuhud, I wouldn't say is a relationship of contradiction or an adversarial relationship. I would say that, yeah, it's more subtle than that, and it's more that Wahdatul Wujud is kind of a much more sort of a more enthusiastic, if you will, exploration, whereas the Wahdatul Shuhud is a bit more tempered, and sort of trying to rein Wahdatul Wujud in a little bit, lest it veer too much towards places it shouldn't go, right? So it's more that kind of a sort of relationship between these two concepts than contradiction or opposition in that way. But yes, I think that answers your question to a certain degree.
Yes, it does. Really, really appreciate the way you built this narrative. Rachana, are there any other ideas and concepts that, particularly in the subcontinent, have been built upon this idea of wahdat by the Sufis?
Unique to the subcontinent. Again, I hesitate to say unique to the subcontinent because there's no culture exists in isolation, and the subcontinent especially has always been at the crossroads of knowledge and thinking and learning, and so I would be hard pressed to make a case for something being uniquely South Asian in that way. But I will say that perhaps perhaps the nervousness about Wahdatul Wujud, both the enthusiasm as well as the nervousness about Wahdatul Wujud that we find in the subcontinent, right? And maybe we can say even a preoccupation with Wahdatul Wujud, either positively or negatively, that we find in the subcontinent, may be because here is a geographically a part of the world where Islamic scholars are actively engaged with Hindus, right? They're actively engaged with a non-Abrahamic, non-monotheistic tradition that has a rich philosophical, theological history. Right. So here you have two sort of major intellectual streams that are engaging, and each with multiple strands, encountering each other, engaging with each other. And so you absolutely see Sufi thinkers, Sufi scholars, Sufi philosophers who are learning from the Hindu traditions, right, are learning from, for example, the Vedantic traditions, right, where again, the Vedantic tradition, the Vedanta tradition in Hinduism very much has overlaps with this idea of the oneness of the power of, the universe, and, questions about dualism and non-dualism is a basic division in Vedanta philosophy. Dualism, Dvaita and Advaita, right? Advaita Vedanta is non-dualism, that is, God or Brahma and creation are not separate immanence, right? And dualism, which is Dvaita Vedanta, where God or Brahma and creation are separate, are dual, right? Transcendent. And so you can see that the Islamic scholars of the subcontinent are engaging not only with their own philosophical tradition, but with this other different and yet not different philosophical tradition. And so you can see why you can sympathize with both the enthusiasm and the nervousness around the idea of Wahdatul Wujud, right? Kind of a fear of the slippery slope of it in the face of a very mainstream polytheistic tradition like Hinduism, but also kind of an enthusiasm in seeing within that polytheistic traditions very familiar strands of monism or monotheism. Right? So perhaps that is why South Asians Sufis are obsessed with Wahdatul Wujud and Wahdatul Shuhud.
That is very much possible. One last thing, Rachana. So where does this idea of God being love, or the attachment of this idea of love with the oneness of God, could you touch upon that?
Yeah. how we have 1 minute. I don't know. I
This
will
is
try. I will.
quite central to the idea of. I mean, you spoke about this earlier also,
Yes. Mhm.
but how does
Um,
it fit into these paradigms that you just
yeah. So
laid?
again, if we think about with the idea of love, with the idea of ishq, I think again, I mentioned this with the in the previous video when I talked about the root of the words Rahman and Rahim. That these words come from the Arabic root word Rahm, which means womb, right? And if we think about it, the so it's inseparable. The idea of the compassion, the benevolence of the divine, as being rooted linguistically, semantically in the idea of a womb, and the womb as this all-encompassing reality for the creature within it, right? And so, if we think about um, God having that kind of womb-like compassion and benevolence, or you can think about it as love, right? Compassion and benevolence as facets of love, protection, security, all of these facets of love. Then for I mentioned this in the previous video, that for the entity within the womb, right, that is the reality, that is the haqq, right? There is no haqq beyond that reality. And so the idea that at a fundamental level, right, the all-encompassing nature of that overlaps with the idea of the all-encompassing nature of the divine. And if divine is all-encompassing, then the divine has to be transcendent and immanent, right? That is the sort of the steps of the discussion, right? That again, going back to, like, if you mathematically a set of the infinite has to encompass contradictions, has to encompass this and that. But in terms of love, the idea being that okay, something sort of a way to explain this just popped into my head, and I'll try to do this quickly, given that we're running short of time. I mentioned that love is seen as having the capacity to diminish the ego, right? And the ego being the barrier that prevents us from perceiving that we are encompassed in love from God, right? Our limited capacity, our capacity to experience the Rahm of God, right? The Rahmanness, the Rahimness of God. Our capacity to experience that is limited by our own ego barrier. And cultivating love for God reduces that ego barrier, allowing us to experience fully the love of God, right? So in that sense, from the human perspective, what I find it hard to say the only way, but one way, right, that the Sufis have identified as an avenue towards experiencing God, like experiencing divinity in its entirety, is through love, right? Is through the immersive experience of love, right? Giving, and through the process of giving love to God, to then perceive it reciprocated, like an immersive sense. And so the love then is not just love starts off as the tool to reduce the ego barrier, but love then is also the goal, right? So love is both the avenue and the destiny, is the path and the destination, right? Another paradox. Right? So I'm going to leave it at that. But
Yes.
yeah. Uh-huh.
Thank you so much, Rachana. You really explained these building blocks of tasawwuf so nicely and in detail. Thank you again. We'll get together next week, and then we'll decide on what our next topic is going to be in this series. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you very much. Khuda Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz.